I hope that with TCKs, when they bring that cultural heritage with them, that it's not misunderstood as cultural appropriation. I get frustrated for TCKs because here in the US, there's the lens of critical race theory of looking through what is appropriate or inappropriate for a white person to be wearing their hair a certain way that maybe is how an African American or Black person might wear their hair. And the understanding is not there that this white individual has grown up in a country where that was the norm. And so it's linking them to that cultural piece of who they are. Same goes with wearing saris or other ethnic clothing in the US. It needs to be talked about, right? About what lens you're looking at. When we want to move the world into a more tolerant and empathetic place, we need to expand, again, our lenses. We need to, again, expand then how people are showing up in the world based on their cultural backgrounds, not just their race background. We're talking about cultural heritage of what are those invisible identity markers, those invisible parts of culture that are part of us that we're in no way at all, no intention, wanting to be offensive, and yet the impact is offensive.
My guest today is Megan Norton, author, third culture kid consultant, intercultural trainer, podcast host of A Culture Story. The daughter of a U.S. diplomat, Megan grew up in 6 countries and has lived in 4 more countries as an adult third culture kid, in addition to 5 U.S. states. This is the second time that I have the pleasure of interviewing Megan. The first interview was conducted in 2021 and is entitled Third Culture Kids. You can find it in season 2. It has been the #1 most downloaded episode for 2 years now. So it is an immense pleasure to welcome Megan Norton back to the podcast. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you so much, Dr. J. It's so good to be back. Thank you for the invitation.
Maybe we could begin by talking about TCKs and CCKs, what these acronyms stand for, and how you relate to them.
Yes, absolutely. So there's an emerging understanding that CCK, this acronym, cross-cultural kid, CCK, is the umbrella term in which traditional TCKs or third culture kids fit into. CCKs do have a significant cross-cultural experience in their adolescent years, but not necessarily have the high mobility piece that TCKs or traditional third culture kids have. CCKs could be children of borderlanders, international adoptees, children of immigrants, children of minorities. All of these are examples of children who have the experience of culturally code switching in significant ways. But TCKs have that and the high mobility piece. So they are navigating cross-cultural experiences in different countries. And I consider myself a third culture kid because I grew up in 6 countries, but I don't consider myself a CCK, cross-cultural kid, because I didn't necessarily have cross-cultural experiences in the ways that perhaps children of borderlanders, international adoptees, children of refugees, immigrants, minorities might have had.
So even though you spent your childhood in 6 different countries, I know this from the last interview, you actually were in an expat community. You grew up still with a lot of Americans. Also, I know you were very active in church, but you had the same group of people, so the same cultural stimuli, if you will, even though you were abroad. And that's the distinguishing factor, right? Whereas the CCKs would be immersed in several different cultures.
Yes, that's one of the distinct factors. I would also give the example of educational CCKs. So educational cross-cultural kids are individuals who are code switching when they cross their school campus gate every morning. So maybe they speak a different language when they're at school versus at home. Maybe the cafeteria canteen food is different from what they would eat at home. So it's that daily code switching that's happening, and that makes them, really have similar nuanced experiences like TCKs, in that you're navigating those different cultural stimuli and increasingly becoming multicultural in the ways that you are shaped and your identity is formed.
Mm-hmm. And when you go into these educational factors or these educational environments, we're going to deal with different ways of presenting history, different ways of presenting politics, different ways of presenting gender relations, religion, etc. as well, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Yep. Those dimensions can add the complexity, can add tension, but it can also add that expansion of being able to shift perspectives and to be able to understand different worldviews.
So for you, how deeply did you get to know the countries that you lived in, if we compare it to CCKs?
Yeah, that's a good question. With TCKs, the assumption is that you are going to return to your passport country or one of your passport countries into your higher education experience or into your adulthood. If we think about CCKs who are immigrating or migrating to another country, the assumption is they're not going to return to their passport country. And so I would say that my experience growing up in these different countries, I always had that link and that attachment to the US country as a whole, but didn't know where I would land or didn't have a strong attachment to a certain state or city in the US. But with that, it gave me a sense of security, gave me a sense of safety, a sense of understanding of this is a salient part of who I am, and I knew I could always return. So there's an element of privilege, there's an element of power there as a TCK when you know that you might have the ability and agency to go back. Some CCKs are fleeing their passport country for safety, for political reasons. So that's one of the ways I would also like to bring up a distinction between TCK and CCK. Just in terms of my personal experience with different countries, it really depended on actually my international school experiences, what courses were required in terms of history of the country, what languages I was required to take as electives, ultimately also what student organizations or clubs or extracurriculars I immersed myself in. So I would say it really fluctuated and depended on what country I was in.
Mm-hmm. And so would you consider me a TCK or a CCK? I know you know my background quite well, so.
Well, I would say both. Essentially, it's not an either or because the CCK is the umbrella term. So we could look at it as TCKs are CCKs, but not all CCKs are TCKs.
Okay. In our preparation for this interview, we wrote back and forth, and you wrote about heart homes. Would you care to let the listeners know what you mean with your heart homes?
One of the really existential questions that can be very anxiety inducing for TCKs is when somebody asks, where are you from? And so instead of necessarily, answering that, I like to say I have several heart homes. And those heart homes include those 6 countries in which I've grown up in, including the 4 countries I've lived in as an adult TCK. All of those countries reside, in different areas of my heart. And so I like to refer to them very lovingly as heart homes.
And to the listeners, again, if you want to find out about Megan's experiences in all these different countries, please listen to the other podcast episode, Third Culture Kids from 2021. There you go, quite in depth into your experiences in Israel, in South Korea, in Japan, etc. So for all the listeners who are interested in finding out about that, please listen to that episode. But now let's talk about your book. Last year, you published the book entitled Belonging Beyond Borders: How Adult Third Culture Kids Can Cultivate a Sense of Belonging. So one of your topics of interest as a TCK is belonging. Would you care to go into that?
Yeah, thank you. Belonging is certainly one of the identity factors for TCKs to navigate. And I think that unpacking belonging and what that means as an individual or as a highly mobile person is to understand where those attachments are to people, to places, also possessions. What are your belongings? One of the factors with belonging is being known and knowing others. So when there's this high mobility piece of constantly saying hello and goodbye to communities, it's also creating these frayed attachments to people who know your story, know your history. And that can be a little bit grief-inducing. That can be also complicated in how you then tell your story. How do you frame your story when you're meeting new people? How do you belong intersectionally to different communities? And so, I really wanted to explore this really big topic that's not exclusive to TCKs. Having a sense of belonging, it's a human need. We are relational beings, but that added layer, if you have the high mobility piece, can really complicate how do you share your story and build community where you are.
I guess you get to reinvent yourself, though. But perhaps that's part of the problem, because moving so much or these changes are constantly allowing you to redefine yourself. And it allows you in a way to completely separate yourself from your past, or the aspects of your past that you no longer want to acknowledge or relate to. So I imagine it also being a problem in that sense, that you're confronted with your own definition of yourself, with your own interaction to your past, with your own interaction to everything that's happened to you so far.
Yes, that's part of the story, right? Of what do you want to let go of, or what do you want to forget? I've had experiences like that, memories of moving from one country to another in middle school, high school, and wanting to, re-strategize of how am I going to make friends, or what am I going to research in pop culture so that I can connect with a new set of friends in a new school. So that's certainly part of the story. Another part is in emerging adulthood, you're always pushing boundaries or testing the waters to see, really what are the consequences for your decision making, or how do you, maybe push the limits of rules. But with TCKs, if they're moving to another country, they actually have to learn the rules before they can test them or break them. So sometimes, that experience will, what some researchers and consultants have called delayed adolescence for TCKs. It's when in their 20s, they finally get a chance to spread their wings a little bit and test what their decisions can be in a new environment into adulthood. So that's another factor to consider.
And And if you continue moving, if there are continuous or several, there's a series of moves, then that does, in a way, stunt your whatever psychological development, your development of self, your definition of yourself. I know this from my own experience. I really feel like I'm missing 10 years. 10 years that have been spent on trying to get to know the different cultures that I've gotten to know, and then trying to know the rules, trying to know how to fit in, trying to make sure that I'm not doing things that will be offensive, that will not allow me to succeed, that will stand in my way, that will create obstacles. And there are so much, I mean, we'll talk about that in a second, about linguistic barriers, but there's so much of this, what you're saying, this arrogance of allowing yourself to break rules, to test politics, to test policies. So it stands in your way of allowing yourself to fully participate, right? I mean, when we are still hesitant, when we're still on the margin, on the edge, we're just barely fitting in. We're just barely hugging a certain culture or a certain society. We are certainly not immersing and diving right into it and, sort of going to the core and actually daring to shape it.
Yeah, I think it depends on, well, what age you're talking about developmentally, and then also even what stage you're at in life. I think for younger TCKs, sometimes they're not afraid of that language barrier. Kids on the playground or playing football, they're going to find that shared identity. They're going to be able to lean into that of, I can't necessarily understand what you're saying verbally, but we have a shared identity of loving this sport or loving this hobby. And so I think that's a skill that TCKs actually need to capitalize on and really celebrate, that even though it might not be the most dominant part of their identity that is a connecting factor for another person in their community, they can find, what do we agree on? What values are in alignment? Because you're getting into also, I think, what are your core values? What are your flux values? And those are going to change in age and stage and also location. And being very clear on what are those core values can add this stability factor for your identity, and also ultimately, what are your motivations for the future? Where are you going to invest time? What are you going to do? So I think, yeah, it really depends. But one of the things I think parents and also systems, leaders, like people who are moving and inviting families to move abroad, is to gain that self-awareness and really know that there needs to be this equipping for families to do this evaluation work of, who are we as a family, what might change, and how does that make us feel? So what are those short-term considerations and also long-term impacts?
Thank you for that comment. It's very interesting. Would you go a little bit into the difference between core values and flex values?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that core values are what will not change based on your circumstance or your cultural environment. Now, the flex part of that is, how is that demonstrated? Very practically, if, for example, I have this value of taking off my shoes before I enter a house, that's a way that I show respect and I show love for people. But in other places, sometimes I go into people's houses in the US and they're like, don't take off your shoes. We don't do that. So for them, love and respect is not that practical thing of taking off your shoes. So yeah, as a family, talking about what are those core values that also are linked to convictions, and then what are those flex values that are linked to preferences.
Mm-hmm. So what are the main factors that make belonging so difficult for TCKs and CCKs?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm finding in talking with TCKs and CCKs is the dominance of I'm a TCK, I'm a CCK, and what does that mean for my identity? If we strip away the idea that TCK, CCK is your identity, it frees up the opportunity for TCKs and CCKs to look at themselves as more holistic human beings with different experiences, different preferences, different likes, different hobbies. Because I find that if TCKs or CCKs are telling themselves, like, I can't belong here, or I don't fit in here, or I can't settle down here, I can't root here because I'm a TCK, because I'm a CCK, it's very limiting then to how they can see connecting points. Ultimately, TCK and CCK is not an identity. It's a profile, it's an experience. And so who are you without telling me that you are a TCK? And that gets into your personality, that gets into your skill sets, it gets into who you are as a person. And so I think that belonging is inviting people to say, who are you? And it gives that room for complexity.
But to what extent are we global citizens? To what extent is the world becoming more and more filled with TCKs and CCKs and global citizens? Because it seems to me that it is more and more difficult to define a German, a Frenchman, an American. And a lot of the intercultural research seems at times outdated or no longer applicable to today's changing global societies.
Yes, I would agree with that there are generalizations and even stereotypes that are grossly inaccurate when thinking about individuals. And even at the nation state level, it's a little bit outdated. Ted Ward in the 1980s claimed that TCKs are the prototype of the global citizen. And that being almost, 50 years ago, it's really important to look at how identity is multifaceted and the cultural nuances that are happening. In my book, I talk about it's really difficult actually to find a homogeneous community sometimes, because even if the community perhaps is homogeneous, the access to look online or be connected to material that is cross-cultural is right at our fingertips. And so I think increasingly, you're right, there's this understanding that cultural dexterity and code switching is becoming a norm. And I think it's really vital for education systems to highlight that, to name it, to validate it, because ultimately, as the world is becoming more complex, there are these spaces that are very binary and exclusive. And so we need people to feel empowered and equipped with how they are crossing cultures on a daily basis to be able to lean into those spaces and be bridge builders.
Very, very, very interesting. So I have been using Gerd Hofstadter's theories and studies for years. And recently, for example, Aaron Meyer's work, The Culture Map, for example. And these are works and books that I find difficult to use. As ways of studying culture, I find them still very relevant and interesting. But oftentimes I run into too many exceptions, too many nuances that I wish had been included. Are you familiar with the two sociologists?
Yes, absolutely. And I tend to agree that it is this binary way of looking. There are these overgeneralizations. They're helpful frameworks in naming what are those cultural differences and misunderstandings you might be feeling, and how do we name those?
Absolutely. I would agree with that. Yeah. I mean, I continue to use those works and admire them, but just recently I've run into difficulties with the generalizations, with the lack of nuance, with the lack of consideration for more global societies within each nation.
Yes, absolutely. It's also interesting to take the spectrums of, are you independent or collectivistic? Are you interdependent or individualistic? And apply them in a personal sense. I think those frameworks and spectrums are helpful even for TCKs and CCKs to understand, because a person might have a family culture that is very collectivistic, and then they might have a school culture that's very individualistic. And so there's that tension within the individual of, what do I align with? What is the expectation in this cultural context? Yeah, it's really interesting if we think about how to apply those individually as well.
I absolutely agree. On an individual level, I absolutely agree. I just think the generalizations to nations is no longer completely accurate.
Yes, absolutely. And even when I do intercultural training for families who are moving to the US, I sometimes say, every US state is kind of its own country. And that's very accurate when we think about federal versus state laws, and freedoms. And also the cultural differences are so vast within the US.
Absolutely. But how would you approach, for example, training businesses or individuals who are using your training for business purposes? If people are interested in relocating to a certain country, and we can no longer generalize that this country or everyone they are going to encounter, or the work ethic or the work culture will be like this. How do you approach that? And how do we approach that in general in the future? This idea of, we are becoming more global, but then there are still these national trends. How do we reconcile the two? And maybe even though it's kind of a loaded, long question, I think that's also a fear some people have, that their individual national cultures, languages, etc., are diluted through this global mix. So how do we deal with that, whether philosophically or practically?
I think it goes into a value of being curious, being open-minded, and understanding that it's going to take some discomfort, experientially, cognitively, effectively, physically, to lean into, what am I stepping into culturally speaking? It's helpful to understand the terms ethnocentric and ethno-relative. So ethnocentric, meaning that you have only a mindset for your own culture, and ethno-relative, meaning that you are open to understanding other cultures and being able to balance your culture with another culture. It goes back to fundamentally, what is your approach into a new culture? And that is stepping out of your comfort zone. You are going to need to stretch. And that is discomforting sometimes, but I think it's really important to know for yourself, where is that stretch too much? Because then that can lead to panic. So be really wise in how you step into that. That can be the work of inviting a coach or a mentor or a trainer to help you navigate, what am I feeling? What's coming up for me? Because if we think about the cultural iceberg model, when we feel that tension, when we feel this conflict, it is our values, it's our thought patterns, it's our beliefs that are in tension with another person or another community. It's not going to be the obvious things of how we talk or how we look, but it's really going to be those deeper parts of culture that we need to understand and have conversation about.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think are the most important skills and competencies that are needed to manage life beyond borders?
Yeah, going along with curiosity, open-mindedness, I think also this tolerance for ambiguity, because there might not be that certainty about time frame or certainty about deadlines or certainty about how to present something. We also need to talk about the difference and similarities between how we understand diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI is actually now becoming DEIB, with belonging being added to that acronym. I think when we add that B, right, the belonging to DEI, we're inviting people into conversation.
So let's go a little bit deeper into this, the B part, right? The belonging part. How does a sense of belonging to a place, right, along with its architecture, its parks, its everything that means something to us, belonging to people, how does this sense of belonging impact the definition of people's identity? How do they then define themselves beyond borders, so to speak?
I think belonging, it's not a static or settled thing. It's a very much dynamic process and ever changing based on where you're at and what community you find yourself in. So we first, I would say, need to get clear on who you are. What are your interests? What are your career motives, your career path? Because that will help get clarity on where to invest time and energy and skills. Yeah, your identity is definitely linked to people, but it's also linked to place. And so, what are places that also feed your soul? I think about weather, I think about recreation. Those are also really important parts of holistically thinking about our well-being. And so dimensionalizing belonging, dimensionalizing that it goes beyond our people connections, but also our place connections. And then for TCKs, CCKs, places are sometimes not as accessible as they were in our childhood. So what are ways that you can keep that connection to place alive through traditions or through language or through community that perhaps are people who also celebrate those traditions, who make the food that you find comforting or that you want to learn because it reminds you of your sense of belonging as a child. So I think we need to unpack belonging in multifaceted ways so that we're not stuck in saying like, I don't belong. I don't belong to people. I don't belong to places, because ultimately, if you're approaching life through that way, you're going to be isolated, lonely. And increasingly, I think that's an issue in our societies. And so how can we then reframe our access and agency to belong?
You have used the word unpack several times, and the cover of your book has a suitcase on it. Would you go a little bit more specifically into your book and how you wrote it and how it's meant to be used as a resource, as a way to offer advice?
Yes, thank you. And I love the word unpack. Yes. Thanks for pointing that out. And even on the cover, like you said, it's a suitcase with plants and flowers coming out of it. Because in the book, I find that a garden analogy really helps us understand our approach to how do we understand that belonging takes time, it takes effort, it takes work. Every chapter does start with a garden analogy metaphor of how do we cultivate our sense of belonging. It doesn't happen overnight.
How do you think we will relate to each other in 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Will we all be multicultural? Will monocultural people or monoplaced individuals be a rarity?
It's a good question. It depends on so many factors, even including access to technology, access to how to understand the globalized world and how to participate in it. The idealistic part of me says, yes, we'll have the outlook and the approach to wanting to connect and live in harmony. The realist part of me is a little bit more cynical and critical of how that's possible. But I think we're seeing, on social media channels and platforms, people are reactive. There can be misunderstanding in that one-dimensional sphere. So I'd like to encourage people who celebrate and lean into their multicultural identities to approach people in quote unquote real life in 3D and have those conversations. It really concerns me when there's a lot of political chatter or misunderstanding, reactive chatter online, when in reality, if we're face to face, is that how we would talk with one another? And so I would hope that we continue to be able to connect in real life and have conversations and have safe spaces to have difficult conversations, because I do think that TCKs, CCKs, multicultural people have this ability to, as I mentioned before, be bridge builders, to connect. Some people are afraid, even if there's a bridge, to cross it. And so we need those individuals who have had experience crossing bridges to take someone's hand and say, come with me, let's go together. Yeah, I'm hopeful, and I hope that I practice what I preach. It does, again, take you into discomfort sometimes. It requires you to have that personal leadership, but innately we all want to connect, and we all love each other. So let's show that.
I love that. I love that answer. Let me dig a tiny bit deeper. So I think one of the things that comes up is, who does the assimilating? Who does the adapting? Who does the learning? Is there such a thing as coming into a culture, or are we all coming into each other's cultures? You talked, for example, at the very beginning, when you talked about CCKs, you talked about refugees, about immigration, about fleeing from war, from atrocities due to political reasons. Can we look at this in a linear way? Is it one person or one group entering another culture? Or is it really always a give and take? And if it is a give and take, then we are enriching each other's cultures at all times. And there is no danger of anything being lost, because everything changes and molds anyway. If you look at, for example, I'm thinking of friends of mine who are of Greek heritage, or Greek ethnicity, if you will. The Greek culture that their parents taught them has nothing to do with the Greece of today, right? So monocultures evolve. Even if you were to close off a culture and try to shelter it or try to cut it off from the world, it will itself evolve. Even if we have a completely segregated community or a completely segregated state or city or nation, this community, this body of people will change still out of their own initiative. And so I think it's kind of interesting that people have fears of their culture being lost, because our culture, our language, it's always evolving. It just depends on what influences we allow in.
Yeah, you bring up such a good point, important point. I think with the rate of globalization and the ways that increasingly younger generations are being bombarded with different things to try out or to consider, it can be even more fast-paced, I think, the rate of cultural change. So whose responsibility is it to preserve culture, and how to do that? You're right that culture is always going to evolve, and let's hold it with open hands, but also with respect.
Because we're addressing two different issues, right? The one is allowing ourselves and our own culture to be enriched by other cultures, being open. And the other one is an important one that you bring up, is maintenance of cultural heritage, right? So it's these two, and it's a difficult line that we have to walk. I know, for example, that I'm quite saddened by the fact that my children will not know Hungarian culture the way I have experienced it. And one aspect of it is, for example, Hungarian humor. I still enjoy Hungarian humor and can really laugh at Hungarian jokes. I think I have taught it to my kids somewhat, but they have learned to enjoy it by observing me enjoy it. They enjoy it because they see that I enjoy it, but they themselves don't actually appreciate it. And that's just one aspect. Don't even get me. This has been the subject of many, many episodes. What we call sushi and buy at the grocery store has nothing to do with the sushi chef who takes 7-8 years to train and make Japanese sushi, and so on. So that's the other aspect of it, and that addresses people's fears, right, of losing touch with these well-defined, rich cultural heritage or traditions, with these rich, well-defined traditions and customs.
And even thinking about some of my friends whose parents do express that grief of you'll not ever understand or be able to celebrate in the way that maybe I celebrated in my passport country or my former passport country. I think sometimes there can be a guilt factor that then the children take on of like feeling guilty that they don't have that interest or the time or capacity to research in that moment or celebrate in that moment. It's a family discussion, right? It's even with extended family, if parents want to have that with their parents or siblings saying, it's just not in reality possible to celebrate this or to be able to learn the language right now, but there are other ways that we are connecting them to their heritage.
And I think we can extrapolate it to a societal conversation as well. I mean, the thing is that these treasures, whether it's culinary, whether it's in sewing techniques, right? A lot of different trades, carpentry, celebrations, religious practices, etc. It's vast, right? Theater, literature, anything. I mean, it's in any area of life. These treasures, these ethnic, national treasures, can be maintained and kept alive, not just by passport holding individuals or individuals who were born in a certain place. Let me give you just a very banal, concrete example. One of my friends in Hungary loves Indian culture, and she dresses in saris. She has learned Indian dance. She comes from a monoculture, well, if you can say monoculture, because she was also born in Romania as a Hungarian. So here we go. We're starting this already. But still, the cultural heritage, the cultural traditions, these treasures that I was talking about, that she has decided to pass on, that she has decided to contribute to bring to the world, is not Hungarian, not Romanian, but Indian. So we can be these ambassadors of culture, even if we are not from a certain place. And this is, again, where TCKs come into play, and where this idea of global citizenship of this, like, from a humanistic point of view, as humans, we can contribute and we can maintain these cultures. I, for example, uphold several Mexican cooking traditions that I insist on being very pure and that I learned when I was in Guadalajara, and I passed that on to my children. My father, he spent a brief time in Korea, but he learned how to make kimchi, and that's something that he continues to make. So, you know what I mean? These are just sort of specific examples of how we can keep pure traditions alive.
And I love those examples that you bring up, and you do with your family. Those make the cultural, family unit so beautiful and diverse. And exposes, I think, children to multiple ways of doing things, of different tastes, of different reasonings for why something is done the way that it's done. And so I celebrate you. I celebrate your dad for doing that. That's incredible. And I hope that with TCKs, when they bring that cultural heritage with them, that it's not misunderstood as cultural appropriation. I get frustrated for TCKs because here in the US, there's the lens of critical race theory of looking through what is appropriate or inappropriate for a white person to be wearing their hair a certain way that maybe is how an African American or Black person might wear their hair. And the understanding is not there that this white individual has grown up in a country where that was the norm. And so it's linking them to that cultural piece of who they are. Same goes with wearing saris or other ethnic clothing in the US. It needs to be talked about, right? About what lens you're looking at. Yeah, when we want to move the world into a more tolerant and empathetic place, we need to expand, again, our lenses. We need to, again, expand then how people are showing up in the world based on their cultural backgrounds, not just their race background.
So would my friend wearing a sari in Hungary be considered appropriation?
It could be. Even sometimes yoga practices are considered cultural appropriation here in the US. And so it can be taken to an extreme in a very polarizing way, unnecessarily. It really frustrates me, if you can tell from my tone of voice, because we're talking about cultural heritage of what are those invisible identity markers, those invisible parts of culture that are part of us that we're in no way at all, no intention, wanting to be offensive, and yet the impact is offensive.
But that seems so exclusivist, because then who has the right? I mean, then we're going back to a question of only if I don't know, by what? By birthplace or by blood? Or, we get into these, for me,
Right.
really highly controversial classifications.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And that's where we need to have conversation. We need to have open dialogue. If we're not having those in real life, there's just that perpetual misunderstanding.
I mean, I would be really deeply saddened if anyone told me that I wasn't allowed to serve Weisswurst with Brezel and beer to pretty much any of our guests. If we have guests from abroad, this is a typical Bavarian breakfast. It's white sausage served with sweet mustard and pretzels and beer. And this is what you get for breakfast if you ever come visit us, because, if you're from abroad, we just think this is a great, I don't know, typically German breakfast. We quite enjoy it. It is not even Northern German. We live in Hamburg. I certainly am not German, but I would feel deeply saddened if anybody thought that this was appropriation, or if anybody thought that this was inappropriate for me to serve. How else can we then adapt cultures and, well, sort of also integrate or, immerse ourselves in these beautiful treasures that I talked about earlier?
I think it's getting to know the story of somebody, getting to know the multicultural story of somebody, because I don't think it would be appropriation if anybody would think that, because they know that you are multicultural and you lean into celebrating and adapting and adopting different ways of eating or of different traditions. So I think before assuming, checking in and saying, what am I judging here? What am I assuming? What might I be missing in this?
But I would find it really lovely if a completely, and I know you don't like the term now, monocultural, but if a monocultural person came to visit us and then continued this Weisswurst tradition wherever they are from or currently living or wherever they would want to continue that?
I think it would be considered that because of their direct experience with it. I think the appropriation comes when there's a fascination and this transactional of this culture can be owned. It can be it's up for changing because that's the way I want to change it. So yeah, I don't want to give the perception or the picture that everything is appropriated or considered appropriated, but it is a factor here in the US that TCKs always kind of grapple with if they don't know somebody or if they're out and about and they get certain looks or something, it's because people don't know their story.
And you think it's more of an issue for TCKs?
I do. Yeah, I absolutely do, because there is that hidden diversity that's part of their cultural heritage that's sometimes not dominant in the community in which they live.
Mm-hmm. Megan, any last closing remarks?
Dr. J, you ask the most amazing questions. I adore talking with you because you dig deep. You're not afraid to go there. You, dare I say, unpack so many different ways of exploring topics. And it's such a joy and delight. And thank you for having this platform and this channel for us to listen in.
Thank you, Megan. And again, to the listeners, please check out Megan's other interview when she and I were both 2 years younger. 2 years less wise.
Oh dear. Yes.
It's a great interview. And again, it has been number one for 2 years. You're unbeatable. It's I bring out other episodes and no one somehow matches you. So you continue.
Well, thank you all.
And please do check out Megan's book. I will put it in the show notes. Megan, thank you so much. I look forward to a third interview in another 2-3 years.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you.